Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I will be presenting the module titled on becoming a social worker. This is part of the paper which is fieldwork and fieldwork supervision. I am Vimla Nadkarni, a former professor at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences and immediate past president of the International Association of Schools of Social Work. So I'll begin this module with the learning objectives. I will be covering the concept of social work, the difference between a professional and non-professional social worker, what are the qualifying criteria and characteristics, the roles and responsibilities of the social worker, values and attitudes for ethical practice, and challenges of becoming a social worker. I'll cover a little brief history of social work in India and abroad, and the most recent international definition of social work, as well as some understanding of the appropriate knowledge, skills, and attitudes to work with people, which is part of the social work program, and the knowledge which is based on theoretical understandings in social, human, and environmental sciences. Social work has always existed in India in the form of charity and philanthropy, which was undertaken by the common citizen, by the religious bodies, giving alms to beggars, giving alms to the poor, feeding the poor, running orphanages, homes for the elderly. This has existed in India from time immemorial. The kings providing social services for their own citizens is also part of our history of social services and charity and philanthropy in India. But social work became professionalized in 1936 when the first school of social work was started by Sir Dorabji Tata Trust. This was started by an American missionary. So the program that we developed initially was based on the American model of social work, of professional social work, which started in the Americas in the early 20th century and in UK and other developed countries. Social work is a practice-based profession and academic discipline that promotes social change and development, social cohesion, and the empowerment and liberation of people. This is the international definition developed by the International Association of Schools of Social Work and the International Federation of Social Workers in 2012. What is important in the definition is to understand that social work is both an academic discipline and a practice-based profession. Hence, fieldwork is an integral part of social work, of the social work program, and fieldwork supervision is very critical for developing effective social workers. We need to emphasize the orientation and training of supervisors and the sustained collaboration between the social work department or college, the agency or organization of practice, the practitioner, supervisor, and the student. So we look at supervision in a holistic manner with these different very important components where there's interaction across these components and stakeholders. You look at the student, the college where the student is studying, the organization where the student is placed for fieldwork, the practitioner supervisor. They all interact with each other for providing effective fieldwork supervision, for creating effective social workers. So the module focuses on the process of developing fieldwork supervisors. As I mentioned earlier, that fieldwork supervisor is very important and contributes to social work education, since uh, practice is very critical to become an effective social worker. A social work program is founded on theory and practice and values and principles. And the fieldwork supervisor is generally a practitioner, a social worker working in different organizations, or may also be the faculty of the social work department. So, who is qualified to become a fieldwork supervisor? Ideally, a practitioner with a postgraduate degree in social work with a minimum of 2 years work experience. But I would say that at least 5 years experience in the field, and I will explain the reasons later. We also may have a practitioner who is a BSW graduate but with at least 5 years field experience and continuing education in the field of social work and allied fields. Because at the BSW level, if the theoretical base is not very strong, so we need the bachelor's graduate to have much more experience as well as continuing education to be eligible to become a fieldwork supervisor. We also expect a high level of motivation, because when social workers are in the field, they are working with different organizations, they always complain that, oh, they have a very heavy workload, they have no time to supervise students. So it's very important that they are motivated to contribute to social work education and they are interested in becoming fieldwork supervisors. And they also have the capacity to move from just doing activities, just performing activities, to reflective practice, which is based on social work and social sciences theory. So they should have the capacity to apply theory to practice and to also theorize on their practice. They should be aware. Why is it important for practitioners to become supervisors? Because working in the field, they are aware of the social context, they are aware of the social issues, whether they are in the urban or rural areas or the tribal areas. They also have had the opportunity to test out their knowledge, skills, and attitudes in the field, and have developed confidence to guide students in their field of practice. So because, for example, as a hospital social worker, I worked for several years in the hospital, so I know the field, I know the context, I know the client system, and I know the different stakeholders involved, and I'm able to relate to them, I'm able to work in a team. Now this is very important, that confidence that I have, so that I don't get threatened when a student comes and performs well and makes demand. So I should be able to meet those demands of the student. And hence, the experience in the field is very important to strengthen the quality of fieldwork and facilitate teaching. So practitioners, therefore, would become good supervisors if they have all these features and characteristics. The process of becoming a fieldwork supervisor, we see that a practitioner playing a dual role of being in the field as well as a supervisor. We can have also a full-time supervisor investing part-time for the student. And as mentioned earlier, they need to be highly motivated and also believe that they can contribute to social work education. In the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, for example, there are part-time supervisors who are appointed. They give 50% of their time for supervision, and that is an advantage because they are able to then give focused supervisory time to the students. Whereas we have practitioners who say that they have too much work in the field. At the same time, they take students, but they are not able to give enough time to the students. So one would have to look at what is ideal. Again, the need for a practitioner in the field. It's important, even if a faculty becomes a practitioner, it is important that the faculty continues to practice in the field. So dirtying your hands in the field is very essential for studying, for being a good supervisor. So to summarize, the criteria for becoming a supervisor refers to a practitioner who has a qualification is qualified as a master's in social work with a grade point average of 4 or 60 to 65% in the final year. Must have work experience of at least 2 to 5 years, interest and motivation to be a supervisor, is ready to give time for supervising students, is also ready to participate in the orientation and training of supervisors, which is conducted by the college or Department of Social Work, displays appropriate social work attitudes, and supports teaching institutions' vision, mission, and value base. So we will now look at the phases in the development of supervisory practice. The supervisor, the practitioner who will become a supervisor, but must participate in the orientation meetings to begin with, in the initial phase of supervision, and also plan students' orientation to the practice setting. The orientation is a continuous process because it would not be possible for a student to know everything about the practice setting, whether working in a hospital, whether placed in the school or placed in the community. Orientation happens, understanding the setting happens over a period of time, and this is a process which the supervisor has to undertake along with the student. The supervisor also plans with the student the tasks based on semester-wise objectives. For example, in the first semester, the student has to learn basic communication skills, basic relationship skills, basic interviewing skill. So the tasks will be organized on the requirement of the semester. The supervisor also oversees the students' field activities. It's important to have on-the-spot observation of the students' performance for better assessment and evaluation. And assessment and evaluation is also a continuous process. Supervisor guides in reporting and documentation, in helping the student write records, in helping the student write reports which are required by the practice setting, and documentation as required by the practice setting. Supervisor must link classroom learning with practice to help the student to link what the student learns in the classroom, in the college or the social work program with the field practice and helps the student with problem solving. So if the student is having difficulty in communicating with a particular client, then the supervisor's role would be to facilitate that process. Preparing for fieldwork placement, as mentioned earlier, the supervisor has to understand semester and year-wise objectives and expectations of the social work program and become familiar with the curriculum in each semester. This is very important for the application of theory to practice. So the fieldwork manual and social work course materials are discussed with the faculty. Also, the supervisor discusses the range of practices experience for a student. So it is a discussion with the college for planning fieldwork for the student. So preparing for fieldwork, where the supervisor has to learn about the curriculum, about the objectives of the program, the semester-wise objective, has to read the fieldwork manual. So prepare themselves for supervision. So orienting and planning fieldwork with a student, where orientation is given to the fieldwork setting and it develops over time. The supervisor discusses objectives and expectations of fieldwork in view of the setting requirements, discusses the special needs which may be facilitative or constraining features of each setting. For example, whether it's a hospital or an orphanage or a community, there may be special needs. In a hospital, for example, the supervisor may want to involve the students in ward rounds. So what role will the student play in that process would need to be discussed. Also, the student has to be very particular about, own health, especially working in a hospital where there are chances of infection spreading. So these are special needs of the setting in which the student, student has to understand and follow certain practices. Similarly, in an orphanage where children are working with deprived children, how the students need to behave with the children. What are the problems likely to be faced, for example, in relation to staff's behavior, which may create problems for student practice in the orphanage. Similarly, in the community, there may be constraining features like political parties interfering with the work, or certain types of leaders interfering with the students' work. The next task is of overseeing and guiding students' work in the field. This involves guidance which will vary according to the objectives of the semester and level of the students' learning. So, for example, in the initial semester, direct observation, on-the-spot field guidance with skills demonstration and assessment of performance will be required. So student requires more hand-holding in the first semester. Even demonstrating in the community, I recall a student who was working in the community in the first semester, had to be introduced to the community people. And of course, she felt a little frightened to be alone there. So the supervisor accompanied her. I accompanied her several times in the field and demonstrated to her how she can interact with children and with the parents and with the adults, with the leaders. And over time, as she developed confidence, she was able to manage more on her own. So a first year student would need much more demonstration and hand holding compared to a fourth semester student who can work more independently, can mobilize people on different issues, and we have the example of the student gradually learning to take sessions on women's health and issues, and also developing, documenting indigenous health practices that women follow in the community. The supervisory role of linking classroom learning with practice involves uh, helping the student apply their theory with practice. There's a common myth about differences between theory and practice. And the myth is uh, practitioners tell students, oh, leave your classroom learning behind because it is not related to the reality of practice. What you learn in the class is not necessarily relevant to what we do in the field. And this is a myth which supervisors, have to sort of show that no, theory that you learn in the classroom is applicable to practice. There would be some differences, but not very radical differences. So, for example, how to interview a client and make an social assessment that is taught in the classroom, these techniques are very much applicable to the field. Though there has to be some adaptation to what is learned in the class, and definitely in certain instances everything may not be applied. But to say that theories is of no use is really superfluous. So the supervisory role is very critical. Students have to be guided to do accurate and proper reporting and documentation. So reporting for the setting is advised by the supervisor in terms of the requirements of the setting. In a hospital, for example, the student may be required to fill in a case sheet giving details about the patient who comes to inquire with the social worker to understand better the disease that he or she is suffering from and the kind of medication that is prescribed. The recording that a student does is the actual supervisory tool of instruction, which is different from the report for the setting. And the supervisor has to help the student to understand different documentation processes. The records help the student to reflect on the activities he or she performs in the field. The supervisor has to understand that the record is an important tool of instruction and encourage the student to use creatively audio and visual tools. However, these have to be used maintaining confidentiality and the client's dignity and respect. For example, children will be very enthusiastic and, to be photographed by the students. However, it is important for the students to take the permission and approval of the parents before going in for photography of the children. Similarly, a person living with HIV may not want to be photographed or video recorded. So the student has to be sensitive to the objections that some of the clients may have for any kind of audio or video recording. The assessment and evaluation is a very important process which the supervisor undertakes based on the criteria laid down by the teaching institution. And this is not an end process, it is a continuous process. It is a reflexive process with ongoing feedback. So from the initial phase of learning of the student till the end of the semester and end of the year, there is constant interaction between the student and supervisor and feedback given the student about his or her performance. It is only through this ongoing process that the supervisor will understand if there are any problems that the student is facing and help to solve these problems. If there are any constraining factors, then how to overcome these constraining factors. It's only through this ongoing supervisory process, and on-the-spot supervision provides direct observation of the student's performance. So evaluation is a participatory process. It's not just a one-way process of the supervisors assessing the student, but the student is also expected to do a self-assessment. This is shared with the supervisor and there is discussion. So the supervisor's evaluation and the student's evaluation are discussed, and if there is a wide discrepancy in the perceptions or in the assessment and the grading, then the faculty from the college, from the department, the faculty advisor intervenes and tries to understand what are the differences and tries to help them to come to some consensus, or decides to then, the college decides the final grading. The student has to be oriented to the criteria and expectations for evaluation from the beginning of fieldwork, and supervisor should not wait till the end for the student to understand, because then the student can always complain that, but the supervisor did not tell me, the supervisor did not tell me about her expectations, supervisor did not tell me that I'm supposed to work with children's groups. Now at the end of the semester, supervisor is telling me I was supposed to work with children's groups. I did not know it. So this is not the correct thing for a supervisor to do. Has to be informed right in advance. The process involves teaching the values, attitudes and ethical practices, supporting values, attitudes and ethical practices which are embedded in the institution and social work code of ethics. The supervisor has to be aware of his or her own prejudices and biases and not impose them on the student. For example, if the supervisor is of a certain religion, say belongs to Christian religion, and may believe that artificial family planning methods should not be advocated to the women and men who come to the family planning center. Now, the supervisor should not impose this on the student, because the social work practice will be that let the client decide, self-determination of the client. So the client should be told about all the methods and then the client should decide. So it is the role of the supervisor to be aware of her his or own biases, whether it's related to caste, whether it's related to age or gender. Sometimes these are more at a subconscious level, and this is a learning process for both the supervisor and the student, and there has to be constant discussion on the values and biases and reflection on it. There are challenges in the supervisory process which should be seen as opportunities for learning and for bettering performance. And these challenges relate to the nature and type of the setting, these challenges related to the student, as well as the supervision, the supervisor and the supervisory process, and the college that is involved in the process. So the setting may limit the freedom of the student to innovate, and there may be barriers in supervision, especially in closed and secondary settings. So in a school setting, for example, the course is so tightly scheduled that the school does not give enough time for the social worker and the student to work with the children. So this can become a limitation for students' practice. The student wants to meet the children. If the student wants to do group work, wants to organize recreation for the children, but because the course is structured so tightly, there is little time. So this becomes a constraint. And the supervisor would have to help the student to negotiate with the principal and the teachers to create that time, because it would be ultimately for the well-being and welfare of the student, and also a better performance of the student. In a particular setting, certain ideologies or theoretical perspective may be difficult to apply. For example, a feminist perspective in a hospital setting or a school setting, if they do not follow it. And at the same time, we have examples of organizations like Sehat, which is the Center for Education, Health, and other allied health and other allied areas. They have demonstrated in a hospital setting of how to work on issues of violence against women, where they've taken up cases of women who are hospitalized because of they being abused. Also because of dowry burns due to dowry problems, etc. So the ideology can become a constraint. Heavy workload, that's very common in our country where populations are large, and in every setting this becomes an issue. So how to deal with a heavy workload? Individual level work can become constrained or limited because of the heavy workload. Supervisor may not be familiar with new concepts or perspectives or code of ethics, which can also become an issue. Supervisor has no time to keep in touch with literature, and there is conflicting ideology or beliefs. I gave the example of a supervisor not believing in certain family planning methods, or a female supervisor, being hesitating to talk to men in authority because of certain lack of confidence. So these can become also challenges, and non-cooperation from other team members. The other team members telling the supervisor that don't give too much to the student, let the student do limited work, because then when the student goes away, all the work will fall on us. So our responsibility will increase. So there can be non-cooperation from other team members also. Challenges relating to the student involves students' discomfort with certain clients or tasks. I remember a student who was placed in a mental health setting, and she developed, she had actually asked for a mental health setting for her fieldwork practice, but she developed a mental health problem. She was not able to cope with that, and so she had to be removed and her practice setting had to be changed. So supervisor has to be very sensitive to the students' discomfort with certain like working with transgenders, working with hijras, or working with people with HIV. Student may not be comfortable. So supervisor has to be aware of that and deal with that challenge. And again here, there may be difference in ideology. Student wants to do activist work, whereas supervisor wants the student to work only in that setting and to do very conventional work within that setting. So there can be a clash of, and that becomes a challenge. The challenges related to the college or university, where the supervisors are not recognized. They want to be recognized as practitioner educators, but the college does not recognize them, does not give them importance. So that also becomes a challenge. There is no compensation for the supervisor. The supervisor is traveling to the college for any supervisory conference. The college does not pay for the travel. So that becomes a problem. There can be conflicting perspectives, as already mentioned, where the college is advocating policy change, the college is advocating activism, whereas the supervisors are not very comfortable with those perspectives. And also poor coordination with the supervisor and practice setting. So faculty don't visit the practice setting. They, do not keep in touch with the supervisor, and therefore it's only at the last minute they'll visit the fieldwork setting and have a discussion with the supervisor. So that is also a major challenge in the process of fieldwork supervision. So to summarize, what we have tried to cover in this module is who can become a supervisor, and of course we look at practitioner, full-time practitioner, part-time supervisor, a practitioner playing a part-time supervisory role, as well as a faculty as a supervisor with practice experience, playing the role of the supervisor. And then we discussed the roles and functions of the supervisor in the different phases of supervision, starting from the induction process of the supervisor to the final grading of the student, to actual evaluation and assessment, and discuss the different tasks that a supervisor needs to perform during these different phases. We also looked at the criteria for becoming an effective supervisor in terms of the qualification, in terms of certain characteristics of the setting, and the supervisor's motivation and interest in contributing to social work education. And finally, we discussed the challenges that arise from the practice setting itself, the supervisory role, the student's role, and the college that is placing students in those settings. References you will find in the e-text. Please read the e-text for the references and links to different articles, and wish you all the best and thank you.